Good afternoon and welcome to this Thursday's Star Reader Zoom chat. I am the host today, Dave Fitzsimmons, cartoonist and columnist of the Arizona Daily Star, and I hope everybody's having a very good day on this beautiful late summer feeling September. Our special guest, and I do mean special in the most affectionate manner, is a teacher and minister. Her name is Marianna Cacciatore, and she's also an author, the author of the book, Being There for Someone in Grief. It is used as a textbook and is a guide for hospice volunteers. And I went online and the reviews are positive. It's all 5 stars. So it's apparently a very welcome book, and some of the reviews praise it for being unsentimental and full of real world counsel and advice, which has to be priceless for someone who is going through grief. Also, I'm sorry it's a long introduction, but she's an impressive human being. Also, Marianna is an emeritus board member of one of our favorite groups, Tu Nidito, Children and Family Services. So please welcome our guest today, Marianna Cacciatore. And I have my first opening question for you, and hopefully this will tease you into talking a little bit about yourself. When I was looking at the reviews, I stumbled across, in a sense, your origin story of how you came to be interested in the subject matter of grief. And I was hoping that you might share that with us and your journey to the present moment.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Welcome everybody, and thank you for showing up. I'm so honored to have been invited to speak today. So thank you. Yeah, when I was a little girl living in Rockford, Illinois, I had a best friend who was really just like twin sisters of separate mothers. My mother used to make us matching clothes. We were born 9 days apart, 11 days apart. And we just did everything together. And one day she was kidnapped and murdered. And it was 1965. It was, it was before even, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was writing about grief and loss, or Stephen Levine, two of the foremost people that taught me everything I know, and a lot of people who are my contemporaries. They were the first people on the scene. So nobody knew what to do. We didn't have, a group of social workers showing up at our school. My parents didn't know what to do. Teachers stopped, just never mentioned her name again except in prayers. And so I was a bit crazy, you can imagine, inside. But everybody looked like they were getting along, and they looked nothing like I felt, really. And so I really thought there was something wrong with me. And I worked very hard to bury those feelings and emotions. And I didn't begin to work on that loss and grief until I was 26 years old. And that was when I entered therapy. My life was not really working for me. And I was beginning to have dreams of Susan. And 4 years later, after I emerged from therapy, I remember the last day of my therapy, my therapist said to me, "So now what do you want to do with your life?" And before I even knew what I was saying, I said, "I want to create a center for children grieving a death. I want all kids to know they don't have to grieve alone. I want all parents to know how to be with their kids. I want all teachers to know how to be with those kids." As luck would have it, just a few weeks later, I was watching Good Morning America, and they featured a story about the very first grief support center for children in the United States. And I wrote down the name through tears, sitting there in my bathrobe, just sobbing, watching these young kids talk about grief. I wrote down the name of the center. I went to the phone as soon as the segment was over. The executive director was there. I said, "I want to come and intern with you." And she let me, and I learned how to create a center, and I came back to Tucson, and I founded at that time in 1990 what was called Children to Children. And 10 years later, in 2000, we merged with Tu Nidito. And so that was the origin story to the center that exists today. And now here we have 30 years of support for children in the Tucson community grieving the death of someone they love.
That, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's a wonderful story of turning tragedy into something very positive. I want to interrupt because you mentioned therapy, but myself, similar in terms of grief. But I was wondering if you might share with all of us what are the ill effects of of maybe stuffing grief, if that's the right word for it.
Of repressing one's grief?
Yeah.
Yeah. It becomes buried within you, and it shows up in all kinds of disguised ways. Overeating, unable to sleep, health problems, relationship problems. And the biggest one for me anyway was a decision that I made all by myself in this dark room in my basement when I was just trying to process through this loss of Susan and how to cope. And the thing that emerged for me was, I am never going to love anybody as much as I loved her. Because I got it, that grief and love were two sides of the same coin. The reason we grieve is that we have loved. And I knew how much I loved her. I knew that I loved her with no holds barred. She was just my best friend. And I knew they were connected. And that has been a very difficult thing for me to process throughout my whole life, because there's always a part of me, even if it isn't in my conscious awareness, there's always a part of me that's holding back a little bit of my love or a lot of my love, afraid to completely let go into that beautiful emotion because of fear of breaking, one's own heart. So that's the biggest one.
Wow. At this point, I want to suggest to our guests here enjoying this chat, if you have a question, feel free to type your question and put it into the chat feature, which you can find the button at the bottom of the black menu where you see mute, stop video, participants, and chat. Click on chat, the chat window will appear, and you can put questions there, or you can simply raise your digital hand by taking your cursor up to your square, and in the upper right-hand corner of your square, a blue bar will appear, and next to ask to unmute will be 3 dots, and those will give you choices where you can raise your hand as well. So if anyone has any, you already have a question from these overachievers. All right, Brian, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question of Marianna.
Yes, unfortunately, I found that I've been touched by suicide in my relationships way more than I think anybody should ever. I've had a coworker, a cousin, my brother, and then also the son of a good friend of mine. And each one of those was a very different relationship. And I'm trying to piece together the kinds of interactions and ways of dealing with all of those things that I kind of need to how do you look at each one of them? Because I understand that I'm not, responsible for trying to have saved them. They all have their own lives and reasons, but each one is a different relationship, and yet the result was the same. And it's trying to piece that together.
Mm-hmm. Well, from my point of view, one of the things you might be asking yourself is, how can I really be there for others who might be grieving a death from suicide? You've been touched by so many suicides that you probably are very primed for being a very good support person. And there's an organization in town that I'm on the board of called the Learning Community for Loss, Grief, and Transition. And we teach a class about suicide for people who really want to know how to be there for others in that special, unique kind of death reason. Suicide has its own stories that go with it, its own trajectory. So it's a thing that stands alone in a certain way within the whole field of grief. So the web address for that is TLC for grief. .org. And there you can see the class on suicide. I'm not sure if we have the next date posted, but I'll see that we get it up there.
Would you have general suggestions for how to support an individual who is lost a loved one to suicide? Is it different in nature from, say, an illness caused death? Or
well, I will say this: listening, just listening alone. The thing is, we're never ever going to actually say just the right thing. That the greatest gift we can give to someone who's grieving is to pay attention and just be there for them in the best listening way possible. You want to take your own story out of it. It's not about me. It's really the thing we're processing through our head. Anytime we want to jump in and give, our story or give advice, we really want to just listen. That's the number one rule, and it takes care of 80% of what's going on. And the unique thing about suicide is that people tend to think that there's a choice in suicide. Like we always say, well, that was his choice. But in fact, you can't really know what it is that went on for the person who has made the decision to take their life. So we want to take our own judgments and concerns, our own bias completely out of the picture. And those who are grieving a death of someone close to them by suicide, they just have their own particular kind of, they might be suffering from guilt about the suicide, or they should have, would have, could have, and they have to walk all the way through that journey themselves. They just do. And it generally, not always, but it generally takes longer than other kinds of losses, because there's a whole lot of oneself that is involved in that particular kind of loss. I'm not the one who teaches the class at the learning community. Two people who have been very touched by suicide do teach it, and boy, are they great teachers. I really highly recommend. And the classes are $35. We've just set the prices so that they're affordable to anyone, and they're a couple of hours long, 2.5 hours. It's just so easy to get through. There's no barriers to being able to take the class.
Thank you for that question, Brian. We have it's a question in the chat, but I would like Thomas McGorry to ask the question himself. Can you unmute yourself, Thomas, and ask Marianna your question? You'll have to unmute yourself. Maybe I can do it. Don't think I can.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Do you subscribe to the Kubler-Ross stages of grieving?
Well, I don't in the order that they are. When she first originally wrote that, she wrote that about people who were dying. And even she said in her lifetime that people had taken it too literally in terms of its order and in every kind of loss. And she wished that she hadn't done it. But I do believe we go through stages. It's just that people tend to want to put them in order and say that if they're missing a stage, then they've done something wrong. And I think that's where it throws us off.
Thank you.
Well, I had to look it up because I remember when my parents died, it was 1979. I remember looking at her book on death and dying, and I found that it was published 1969. That's more than 50 years ago. I thought, wow, it has to be updated.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Thomas. We had another good, well, Kathy, I'd like you to ask your question in person. It's in the chat, but I'd like to hear you ask your question. Can you unmute yourself, Kathy Scott?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, because even as a counselor yourself, it's very difficult every time. But here's my question. Was kind of personal. Was there any closure to the tragedy of you are losing your friend by having the perpetrator arrested and convicted? I personally have gone through this. I was a baby, but my family did. An aunt and her 2-year-old son were murdered. They were at his birthday party in New York, and the mother went to get the birthday cake. Stevie wanted to go with her. Everybody said, he's only 2, stay, play with the kids, but he wanted to go with the mother. They never came back. They found their bodies in the Hudson River a few days later. So, and the killer was never caught. As tragic as that is, we've had deaths of grandparents and even younger people. There's grief, but the grief for my Aunt Fran and Stevie carried my parents to their own graves because there was no closure. Can you talk about that and what happened in your own life?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the person actually was apprehended, and he was accused of second-degree murder instead of first, and he was released after 30 years, and perhaps even 25 on good behavior. So, you know, for me, I was a child, and I want to say that there's a certain kind of innocence in children that is different than adults. I would say that from what I might know about her family, there were a lot of problems around the issue of him not being convicted properly or not, you know, being put to death, for example. But for me, I was just innocent. I was a child. It really wasn't about him. It really wasn't. And in my current, I've just completed a manuscript, and I'm hoping that it will be published. Sounds True has it right now in their hands. And that book talks about an experience I had that came out of a dream of him, of the murderer. And it's a very powerful chapter in the new book called Stitching the Heart Back Together, Enduring Our Grief, Inspiring Love and Generosity. So when that book is merged, if you are interested in that topic, that would really be a good place to follow up.
Good question. We have a question from Patrick Cunningham. Mr. Cunningham, if you could unmute yourself, I'd like you to ask your 2 questions yourself in person to Marianna Cacciatore. Are you there? There you are.
Hi, Fitz. Hi, everybody. Hi, Marianna. I have 2 questions. One, I'm wondering what has changed for you, and as you see it for our world, related to grief since you authored your beautiful book in 2010, and or your understandings of grief since that time you wrote that. And the other thing is I'd really like you to talk about men and grief. There's a book that I found very helpful over the years related to men's depression and some of the unique issues that men face in depression, and talking about it and seeking help. That's called I Don't Want to Talk About It. Well, it's true about depression, but it's also true about grief. And the grief groups I've been involved in, the grief groups that I've led, are 95, 98% with women, very few men in those groups. And when they do come, they're often mute and don't really talk about anything related to their grief or their feelings. They're on board, they're present, they're listening, but they don't talk about it.
Mhm.
So those two things, what's changed and men in grief.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, at the time that I published my first book, Being There for Someone in Grief, I was no longer working in the field of grief. I was working in the field of philanthropy. I had gotten a job as executive director of a national philanthropic organization called Bread for the Journey that did grassroots neighborhood philanthropy in 26 cities around the country. So at that time, I was beginning to see a relationship actually between grief and generosity. And it became the seed for the book I have just completed, which I'm hoping will be published in the next, 6 months.
Cross my fingers.
Pardon me?
Cross my fingers.
Yeah, let's hope so. Thank you. So that book takes grief and it gives it a wider view and a longer path. It helps, it really focuses a bit on really what is called the last stage of grief in the grieving process, which is reinvesting in life. There is a moment when you're coming out of that deep cocoon of grief, when you see the blue sky and it almost looks like a blue you've never seen before in your life. You're emerging out and you take a breath like you've never taken. And if you understand what's happening right at that moment, if you could actually slow the film down of your life, you would notice that there's a moment when a generous impulse arises, and we call it spiritual physics. That as we are fed, so do we wish to feed. The moment we begin to feel life again, we want to do something. If you could actually notice how many times in a day, week, month, year that generous impulse arises and act on it, it begins to move us into truly reinvesting in life and not just resigning ourselves to life, without the thing we lost. And the difference between those two are night and day. And that's the topic of the new book. So that's really what has changed. And regarding men, I think I would say that men grieve differently. That's really the biggest thing I have learned. I've worked with many men who have fully gone through their grief process. They just don't do it the same way women do it. Women do it, it's an external process. Men do it much more of an internal process. And I'm not saying that there aren't some men who just don't do the work, as there are women who don't do the work. But I think that, the way, little boys were raised was about not being allowed to actually fully express the full range of emotional feelings they have, right? And so they come to that kind of internal way of doing it, quite honestly. And I think the landscape of that is changing too, again, and I've also worked with many men who do it outwardly, who do it openly, and who are there saying what they need to say, feeling what they need to feel, and processing through what they need to process through.
That's the way I was raised. Definitely, big boys don't cry. Real men don't cry, and I've found, fortunately, as I've grown older, that real men do cry, and embrace that as every part of my masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to talk a little bit about Tu Nidito, because I was asked 1,000 years ago to visit Tu Nidito because of my experience with my parents and caring for them when I was young. And I was taken aback. I was asked to entertain. And I discovered that many who deal with grief and death rely on a very healthy sense of humor, which I know this might sound inappropriate, but I found this to be true of hospice nurses as well. Just the loveliest, most wonderful human beings. And the humor that is used as a salve, I just found to be an amazing gift. Would you feel comfortable talking about the role of humor in grief?
Well, for me, it has to be real and natural. So I guess I would say, if you're feeling like you've just had one too many dark days, the thing I would do is find a movie I really loved, My Cousin Vinny or something. And just put yourself in a situation where you get to laugh out loud, belly laugh. Because so much doesn't seem very funny at all, right?
Right.
And sometimes people go through periods where they don't even feel like they deserve to be able to laugh. They're feeling some kind of guilt or they're just in a dark place where they can't feel it. So times when we can, throw our head back and let go. I remember one of the very first times when I came out of grief, that moment I was talking about where the blue sky is like the bluest blue you've ever seen in your life. I was walking through a park in Berkeley and they had a swing set that looked very much like the swing set of my childhood. And I thought, oh, I haven't swung in years. I was well into my adulthood by then. I got on the swing and I began swinging and I laughed so loud. I mean, it was laughter that just, it was 4 or 5 or 6 minutes of just wild, childish child play laughter. And when I got off the swing, there was somebody who I hadn't known sort of behind me, sitting under a tree, just taking his lunch break, who came over and just said that was the most fun thing he'd seen in years.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I was struck at this. I wandered into a room. I was guided into a room, given a tour of Tu Nidito, where a workshop had just happened with kids. And there was a mobile hanging from the ceiling, and the kids had made out of construction paper. And I have to admit, I already have kind of a grim sense of humor because of the early death experience. But the kids, the assignment was to make epitaphs. And they would hang these epitaphs. And I was struck by how poetic and how humorous so many of them were. And I thought, how healthy. What a healthy way to talk about the terrible pain that these kids were going through. I want to jump back to the chat. Arlene Watkins notes in the chat, going back to Kathy's question for a moment about closure. Does it help to confront the murderer as people are doing these days? It's a rare person who is able to forgive. How do they get there?
I don't understand the first part of that. Does it help to confront the murderer as people are doing these days? Can you be a little bit more clear of what you're referring to?
Arlene?
Arlene? Sure. What we're hearing about more, like in the press and so forth, is that when someone has been apprehended and convicted, there's an opportunity for family members right there in the courtroom to confront and share their grief. And I think that's fairly recent, or maybe I just wasn't aware. And I'm wondering how helpful that is. I don't have any preconceived notion one way or the other. And likewise, we also hear about people who, it's very rare, but are able to forgive. And I just kind of wonder how they get there. I mean, is it maybe like a long history of having been a spiritual or religious person? Is it counseling? So those were my 2 questions.
Yeah, it's different. The forgiveness piece is different for everyone, but let me go to the first part of your question first. Yeah, that I think people do feel a great sense of relief being able to say what they need to say to the person who murdered the person they loved and cared about. The place where we want to get into trouble, where we can get into trouble, is around kind of living in that place of blame and revenge, because that is so painful to the person carrying it, right? It hurts. And people think they somehow need to hang on to that. They feel like they're being disloyal to the person who was murdered if they don't hang on to that. So, but the upside really of being able to speak to the murderer is that you begin to process through some of the internal stuff, if you do. And I'm thinking now about the truth and reconciliation process that went on after apartheid in South Africa and the work that happened there. Now it was more full-bodied. They really were able to go up to the, the room was set up like a courtroom, and the perpetrator, or those who were perpetrated upon, could go up and sit in the chair and begin to tell their story. That was really what they were asked to do. And then right after that, the perpetrator, if they were in the room, could go right up to the chair and begin to tell the story of how they got where they got. And there was so much healing that happened in that process. It was very powerful. And if anybody has an opportunity to read anything about the truth and reconciliation process that was overseen by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, it's a very valuable thing to read. And in fact, I'm currently listening to Tutu's current book, which is called The Book of Forgiving. And honestly, I've never read a book so complete and honest and true and real about the art of forgiveness as that book. I would highly recommend it to everybody in this room. It's called The Book of Forgiving. Archbishop Desmond Tutu writes it with his daughter.
Thank you for that question, Arlene. Kathy Scott again, please unmute yourself and share your remark.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Found out at lunch today that someone that we all work with here in the district is on a ventilator and not expected to live another couple of days, who was unvaccinated, even though we in my community have a very high vaccination rate. And I processing this as anger. I'm sure there will be grief, but how does that happen? How do you process the anger before the grief or simultaneously? Any suggestion would be appreciated.
Anger is part of grief. It is just the journey. And some of us experience it depending on the loss. Some of us do, and some of us don't. And really, it's always the same. Just be as kind and gentle with yourself as you can be in that process. You're allowed to feel any feelings there are, but we don't want to act on it. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to hurt things. So the journey is yours alone. And however it is that, I know for a while, one of the things I did was I got a wiffle ball bat, and I used to hit my bed with it because there's a sound, just a perfect sound that comes through with that wiffle ball bat right onto the edge, right onto the mattress of a bed, that just has a whack to it that was completely satisfying to me. Screaming or dancing or yelling, or I've heard of people going to Goodwill and buying 25, ceramic dishes and going out to the backyard and just throwing it against a wall and letting them break because you could care less, but moving it out of the body as much as you can, doing whatever you can to move it out. We don't want to live with it. We don't want to bury it. We don't want to let it just get old and moldy or go deeper, inside us in some kind of way that makes us more cynical or depresses us, right? So you want to get it out of the body, and you don't want to hurt people, and you don't want to hurt yourself or things. That's really the guideline with anger, and that is grief.
Thank you for that question, Kathy, and I'm sorry for what y'all are going through. We have a good question from Carol Jones. Carol, can you unmute yourself? I'd like you to ask Marianna yourself. Are you still with us,
Yeah.
Carol Jones?
Yes.
There you are. Hi.
Well, my husband passed away a year ago, and we had very good friends that we were very close to for 45 years. The four of us were very close. And I really didn't hear, they did call me right after he passed away, We delayed his memorial service because of COVID and just had it more recently. 2 days before, they live in another state, so they don't live here, and are elderly, so I didn't expect them to come. But 2 days before his memorial service, they said they were having a birthday lunch for the husband, and they would not be able to watch the live stream. And I felt hurt and confused and thought, I just don't know what to make with this or know how to deal with it. I haven't heard from him since.
Mhm.
And we were very close.
Yeah,
I don't know how to
right.
process this, I guess.
Yeah. There are so many things we can't control about what happens around grief and loss. And actually, there's so many things we can't control about life. It's just that all the shoulds that happen around the rituals of mourning seem stronger and more important than almost anything else. And when they get broken, we are hurt and disappointed and lost and confused. But it's another one of those things to reinforce this idea that we can't control much of anything in life. And this is what their story is. And you don't even know why. You don't even really know the whole story. It could be a number of things. It could be that there are too many losses happening in their life right now, and they've just gotten to a place where they cannot cope. And on top of that, they don't know how to speak about it in a way that can be understood by others. And in fact, if they could, who knows what kind of compassion might rise up in those who are listening. So my job always is to give people the benefit of the doubt. That is a very hard and generous thing to do, but in a conscious way, it's what we want to do. We just love them no matter what, because we have no idea what story they're carrying.
Yeah, good
Thank you.
Good question. Marianna, I was hoping that you might talk a little bit at length and in general about Tu Nidito, their mission, what they do, how they do it, and I'll post how we can donate on
Right.
the chat.
Beautiful. It's wonderful. Such a fabulous organization run by a lot of beautiful people. The executive director is Liz McCusker. She has done a fabulous job with this organization in the last 20 years. They serve children who are grieving a death of someone they love. And they begin serving children as young as 3 years old and up into young adulthood. Used to be 18 and now I think it's older. And they're also serving, in addition to that, families who have somebody who is, in a life-threatening illness situation. So they provide services to the whole family. If you were to walk into the doors of Tu Nidito, what you would see is a place that was once somebody's home. And so the atmosphere immediately is warm and cozy and inviting and family-like. And if they were to give you a tour, you'd walk through the rooms and you'd see walls painted with bright colored murals, and the floor is filled with, primary colored pillows and artwork everywhere. And what they try to really do is normalize grief. Kids walk in there feeling like they're the only ones who lost a mother or a father, or a grandparent or a brother or sister. And it doesn't take long at all for them to find a whole network of kids their own age who are doing the same thing that they're doing, who have the same kind of losses that they had. And they sit in a circle on the floor. There's usually one facilitator for every 2 kids. So the kids get a tremendous amount of attention. They're allowed to speak, but don't have to speak. Everything is given to them in terms of games to play. There's an outdoor area where they can run and express their grief in wild, frantic movements. There's a volcano room there. It's a room that we had padded all four walls padded. And the kids come in there and they have these bats called batakas that are made out of foam, and these large cubes the size of a small bedroom dresser. And these kids can just, no more than 2 or 3 kids at a time. There has to be 1 or 2 facilitators in there, but they get to just go crazy and hit the cube and play swords with each other. And they emerge out of that room just sweaty and happy. And we just teach them in that instance that it's okay to be angry, that as long as they don't hurt anybody or hurt themselves. Anger is a normal emotion, and rarely in life do we ever get an opportunity to have that. The adults always wanted to have a volcano room for the adults too. Yeah. So in an evening, the groups are split up into littles, middles, so their kids are age appropriate, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and so on, all the way into the adult ages. And there's a separate place where all of the adults who come with those kids also meet, and they stay. The services are free, and they stay as long as a family needs to stay until their work is done. And there's a beautiful formal closure process for them when they leave. Not to say that their grief is completely done, but that for now, the work that they're doing at Tu Nidito is done.
Thank you. An extraordinary place.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. Tim Curtis, can you unmute yourself and feel free to ask Marianna Cacciatore your question?
I think I know the answer to my question already, and she's already addressed that, but I would like to ask another question. Tu Nidito sounds wonderful, and I do know about it, but where do we grieving adults find our Tu Nidito?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to probably open this up to everybody else in the circle. I will say, the center that I'm working with right now is really about grief education. And although we don't think that somebody who's raw in grief is the right place for them, but for most people who want to know more about grief, just from an educational point of view, that our whole organization, the Learning Community for Loss, Grief, and Transition, was designed to provide just that. And so there's a lot of time spent sharing information and then hearing back from the people who are in the group. It's very interactive, these classes. And then, I do know that almost all of the hospices in town, and definitely Casa de la Luz, provide grief support groups for adults who are grieving the death of someone they love, of any kind. You don't have to have used their hospice services to benefit from these. And I think they are also a resource for other grief support groups that happen around town. I also know that churches are the greatest place, it's common to find support groups for grieving adults at churches. And then I would open it up to anybody else to put into the chat line. If there's a grief support group that you know about, please add it to the list. I'm less plugged in right now to what all the various ways that one can get grief support as an adult in Tucson.
I'm curious how, because it might surprise you that I'm a judgmental and opinionated person. And if I have an acquaintance who appears to be grieving, but in my opinion, not grieving in a healthy fashion,
Right.
Is any kind of intervention appropriate, or is that just not going to work? It's just up to the individual.
Mm-hmm. No, I think if my rule of thumb is this: if I have a friend that I think is on a path to something that isn't very healthy, what I'll usually say to them is this: I feel like I need to talk with you about something, and I want to assure you that I'm only going to bring it up once. I will say it, and then it will be over. I'm going to love you no matter what you do, and I want you to hear that loud and clear. And I'm going to reinforce this idea. I'm going to say it once, and I'm not going to say it again. I'm not going to be one of those friends that harps on you. And then I would just say what it is I needed to say in as loving a way as I could say it, sort of from an I statement thing. It hurts me to see you drinking like this. And what I think it is about is your grief. I'm just using drinking as an example here, right? And say what you want to say. Try to use as many I statements as not you statements, and say it as succinctly as you possibly can. This is not something you want to belabor. You don't want to bring up all their past issues and tell, yeah, nobody wants to hear that. But saying it clearly, succinctly, quickly, and to assure them that you're going to, from the very beginning, you're not going to say it again, and that you're going to love them no matter what they do. And then you have to follow through. You have to love them no matter what they do.
Tough. Thank you. Arlene, I'd like you to unmute yourself and share your praise for a local agency that was very helpful for you. Can you, oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There you are.
I was
Hi,
just going
Arlene.
to say, I didn't know about the hospice grieving services, and I also didn't know that anyone could go, whether or not they'd been in hospice or they'd been to that particular hospice. But they called after my mother passed away, and it was a really hard death for me. She was 90 and we were very close. I must start crying. And first I got into a grieving group, and there were 6 of us, 2 men, 4 women, and it was on Zoom, and it was over 8 weeks, and it was just absolutely wonderful. I don't think I could have made it without that group. To be able to meet and to talk, it was so helpful. And her birthday's coming up, so I think I'm going to call and do a one-on-one with one of the counselors at that hospice as well. So I would just say, if you know of someone that who's in grief, to really encourage them to use the hospice services. Okay.
That's wonderful, Arlene. Thank you.
Fitz, we had a previous guest at the beginning of the pandemic, Bobby Rill, and her husband, they co-run the Grief and Wellness Group. I'll share the link in the chat, but that was a really amazing, session because it, also focused on adults and their grief and the different types of grief, because I think sometimes we compartmentalize like grief is someone dying, but it's like grief can be loss of anything, and so they work, mostly with adults there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a great suggestion. I had forgotten about that group, and I'm glad you brought it up. And I want to reinforce another thing you said here, which is we've been talking a lot about death, grief as it relates to death here, and grief as it relates to the loss of a job or career, grief that happens when we move into retirement, grief that happens when we have a health issue. The list goes on and on and on. Divorce, any kind of a breakup. There are so many things. In fact, I actually believe at the base of any kind of painful suffering that we go through, if you peel back the layers, you'll always find at the core of it some significant loss that was the beginning seed for what came after. So we grieve many things, not just the death of someone we love.
In our Zoom chat, our good friend Thomas Magore, hi Thomas, asked a question, but brings up a group I'm familiar with as well, Homicide Survivors. Which is a very interesting group, a very positive group, considering the difficult challenge they must meet with their clients. Yeah. I can't resist but blurt this anecdote. So I was speaking to the group, and I don't really speak, it's interactive. So I call people up, I ask them what they're going through, and I draw them. And the first individual I called up out of the crowd of homicide survivors was a local funeral home director. He was a jolly fellow. And so when I drew his portrait, I took my pad and I turned it on his side so he was lying down. And the audience thought that was very funny, which is tasteless and inappropriate, but it really cracked open a healthy conversation about the group's wonderful purpose.
Marianna, I was just curious, with what we were just talking about with grief, this pandemic, I know we do have some older ones here that may have gone through some of these previous, pandemic-like things, but, the pandemic in itself, I've been talking to some even younger than me ones, and they're just like grieving this huge section of their life that they've just lost, like times when they would have been traveling and, like when they turned 21 and, like big life events that, they just lost, because here we're in lockdown or during the pandemic. And I just kind of wonder your thoughts of like, once we come out of this, or maybe already, like, are people kind of like creating support groups for the pandemic? Or I don't know. I mean, just because I think that pandemic fatigue is so real and it's really played such a head game with all of us that we all kind of need a little help.
Right. Well, I don't know about any support groups, although I imagine there will be some that emerge out of that. But I think, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot regarding this pandemic is our relationship with uncertainty. And I know for me, when my best friend was murdered, the rug got pulled out from under me, and so began my relationship with uncertainty. And one can, fight that tooth and nail, or one can learn that getting comfortable with that life just is like this. It has its ups and downs, and I'm doing this in a very even way. And sometimes it's actually like this. And the pandemic is one of those things. And I think that my teacher, Pema Chodron, who is a Buddhist nun, has written many books about getting comfortable with uncertainty. And I think it's one of the things that we all are challenged to have to learn to do. But when we do, actually, when uncertain things happen, we have a little bit more, scooch more ease, I would say, with them every time one of those things happen, until we get to a place where our anxiety isn't just always peaking whenever something happens that isn't something we thought was going to happen. The world is an uncertain place, and we don't ever hope or wish for big dramatic things like the murder of your best friend to happen to teach you that. However, they happen. And so the more all of it, we're all getting this, the entire planet is getting to get an experience of looking at what uncertainty does to them. And hopefully more and more people can begin to get educated about the importance of getting a little more comfortable with uncertainty. And that author that I mentioned, her name is Pema Chodron. Pemachobron, and she has a ton of books out there. She's a prolific writer, great teacher, Buddhist nun.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for two more questions. First, Brian Gross. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, my problem is dealing with the grief of kind of existential grief of finding out just how stupid and selfish so many of my fellow citizens actually are, and that this has brought that to a head. And unfortunately, I don't see it going away. So how do you deal with something like that? A change to your feeling of how the world around you works.
Mm-hmm. Right. For me, it's always been an inside job, really. It comes back to looking at the places where I am holding judgment and what kinds of things I can do to make it different. I think what is true for the macrocosm is true for the, well, I should need to say it the other way around. What is true for the microcosm is true for the macrocosm. And so when it comes to shifting the consciousness of the planet, maybe not the only thing we can do, the primary thing we can do is change the consciousness within ourselves. And that a lot of that really does have to do with where are the places that we hold criticism and judgment about others? How can we look at, where do we do that even for ourselves? My life is a spiritual life. I operate as a minister. So I am always moving to how can I be gentle? How can I be kinder? How can I be more forgiving? And I think that is a task for every human being on this planet. And what I have found myself is that the many places where I held tremendous judgment have softened, and my world actually has become, my immediate world, my close relationships has become kinder and gentler. The kinder and gentler I was with my own self, with my own thoughts, and with my own internal journey. So it always starts here. And it's we have to remember, a long journey. We've come a long way, but oh my, we have a long ways to go.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Not going to happen in our lifetime. Let's put it that way.
No.
Patrick Cunningham, unmute yourself, lad.
Hello there. I just wanted to speak to the pandemic population that's grieving and will grieve for the rest of their lives, and that is the student population, the kids. I have a junior, a daughter who is straight A student through middle school and her high school. She's a junior at CDO now, and she missed her entire, because of some underlying health issues that I had, and before I could be vaccinated, she missed her entire sophomore year. It was done online at ASU Prep Digital, and it was awful. The school was good, but she died, a little piece of her died every day. And she has multitudes of friends that are depressed, they're anxious, they're sad, they're homecoming's coming up, and it's like, we didn't get homecoming last year, or we didn't get to go to graduation, or we didn't get to do this, or we didn't get to do that, or I didn't see my closest friends for over a year. And there's a huge opportunity that I am really interested in working with that population to be able to have them just grieve and mourn and cry and do whatever they need to do to redeem that awful and strange and broken year where every one of them suffered and their families suffered, and their mom and dads suffered watching them suffer with little they could do in the uncertainty. So there it is. Those kids need some help desperately, and it'll be like the generation that experienced the Great Depression. It forever altered how they made decisions about money, about relationships, about having families, about what to do for a living, and this is going to alter that generation as much or more than the Great Depression altered those that experienced it as children.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Patrick.
I would love to add one thing to that. And I would say that in any programs that are designed to really help that generation grieve their losses, I hope that what is built into that is also an aspect of service and a kind of generosity, some unique way for them to reach out and provide something of care and support to another in greater need. Because what that does is it helps balance out the internal woe is me thing that needs to happen because of grief with some kind of reaching out to humanity that might have been suffering in a completely different way. It might be somebody who's in the hospital because they have, somebody their age in the hospital because they have an illness that wasn't COVID related, or somebody in a developing nation who doesn't even have water. So balance those two things so that that is kind of built into it, so that the grief has a way to kind of open up into something greater that connects them to others around the whole world in a generous way.
Thank you for that. Marianna Cacciatore, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for sharing your beautiful and profound wisdom with us. It was a wonderful hour.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm just so honored. Thank you to everybody. And please, I invite you to go to the Learning Community for Loss, Grief, and Transitions website. Join us for any one of those classes and you get to learn more and more. So thank you.
Absolutely. Sarah Brown, who will be our guest on next week's Reader Chat?
Yes, I just want to echo that. Thank you so much, Marianna. It just felt like a very healing hour talking about, you know, all the work we can really do on ourselves and maybe some possible ways to help us. So next week, we actually have Mark Clark, who's going to be joining us, and he is the president and CEO of Pima Council on Aging. They do so much for the Tucson community. They offer so many things, but sometimes we don't even know what services are available to help us. So Mark is going to be able to talk about all about PCOA, what they do, what they offer, how to reach them. So we're just really going to find out some helpful tips. So if you know of anyone that's, you know, being a caretaker that's looking for help, tell them to join us next week. Or maybe you need it yourself, you need services, join us next week. Let's learn more about them.
All righty. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Marianna. And thank you, all of our attendees today. Have a beautiful day. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.